Hello. Today we're going to look through session two. And session two is based on the idea of faith versus grace and law versus works. And our key passage today is from Galatians 2:11 to 3:14. And the key verse in the passage that we've kind of selected is from Galatians 2:21. I do not treat the grace of God as meaningless, for if keeping the law could make us right with God, then there was no need for Christ to die. So we're going to use the triple C, context, content, and consider to unpack this passage a little bit. I won't look at everything, but I'll give a really brief triple C approach to this. So let's look a little bit at context. It says to look into the context of the verse in relation to the passage, and then any other important historical or cultural elements that is relevant to the understanding the passage. So one of the things that we need to understand in the context of this passage is the law. In particular, this passage addressed the idea of circumcision, which actually existed from the time of Abraham, where God asked him to circumcise himself and his family and their slaves as well that were following them around. And that was to set them apart from other nations. And it's kind of like a symbolism and a physical act of being different from other nations who were actually practicing a lot of corruption and evil during that time. In a closer look at this situation, the Jews in Jerusalem at this time were trying to make the Gentiles follow the Jewish law, in particular the act of circumcision, in order to be justified and to be saved. There was even a group called the Circumcision Party. And one thing you need to understand about the Jews is that even though God gave the Ten Commandments, and then he also gave Israel at that time, when they left Exodus, they gave them a lot of laws to follow because that was specific to their community at that time and space. But what happened was that the religious leaders actually added a lot of other laws to prevent people from breaking the Ten Commandments, and to the point where they actually took some of those things too far. So, for example, Jesus and his disciples, they also weren't spared from these religious leaders who tried to question what they were doing. So, for example, when they were walking through the grain fields on Sabbath, and the disciples were just picking some grains to eat, and the religious leaders actually questioned them. When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, they also questioned him, and so they were taking the law too far. That's a bit of context. In terms of the content, what's actually happening in this passage, what's the narrative? Peter, who was a disciple of Jesus, he was actually one of the first to be, for God to reveal to him that the salvation was not only meant for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. And he showed Peter in a vision. But Peter was, even though he actually believed that the Gentiles were saved and could be saved through Jesus Christ, when in this context of being around the Jewish circumcision party, a group of Jewish people who I think were very highly influential, he was almost fearful of them, and he was not wanting to mix with the Gentiles because the Jewish party would have looked on him unfavorably, and so he kind of betrayed his own beliefs and sat away from the Gentiles and actually sat with the Jewish men. And on top of that, he influenced one of the younger Christians, Barnabas, to do the same. And in this passage, Paul actually addresses him publicly and kind of tells him off publicly. And some of us might go, whoa, why did Paul talk to him so publicly? Why didn't he just take him, aside privately to talk through this? It's a bit shameful to do that, right? But I think because Peter was a person of influence, a leader, a lot of people actually looked to him as the model, as the example. And so Paul needed to address this situation publicly because it was a public problem. And he wanted to nip it in the bud and prevent this belief and this behavior from perpetuating, especially with the Jewish Christians. Paul also addressed the idea of hypocrisy, and the original meaning of that was actually putting on a mask. So even though Paul knew that the Gentiles were saved and it is by grace that we are saved, his actions actually elevated the law and suggested that the law was actually what justified people. And so as we keep going, we're going to go to the next bit now with consider. What's the general application for us, and even like a personal one? I think for myself, when I think of living by the law instead of the grace of God, and therefore making Jesus' death redundant, I think if I was to elevate the law in my life and think that it's only by my merits and by the things that I do that I am saved, then I will constantly actually have this internal striving. But the truth is that whatever I do, I will never be good enough. And I think that internal striving will actually tire me out, will make me dissatisfied, will actually hinder my relationship with God, because it will come from a place of putting myself as the savior rather than Christ where he is, and resting in the power of what Christ has done for me. Externally, I think if I was to have this underlying belief of believing that the law can actually make myself whole or make myself save myself, then I might expect other people to also do the same. And so I might actually have unrealistic expectations on other people, and expectations that they'll never be able to meet, and hold them against the law or my own version of the law or what I think they should be doing that is right, instead of actually showing them grace that Christ has first shown me. And so I think understanding this truth that it is by the grace of God that we are saved, and that keeping the law doesn't actually make us right with God. In fact, it was Christ that actually makes us have that full relationship with Christ, with God, and be able to have that right standing with him and that relationship with him as he intends. So yeah, I hope this helps a little bit.